What's up, guys? Welcome back for another EVE Online video. This one's going to be kind of a weird one and kind of a follow-up to the video I made quite a while ago about risk-adverse mindset, or really just kind of like player psychology in EVE Online in terms of like the amount of time people play and kind of how their behavior changes and how that can maybe affect burnout or whatever. And this kind of happens with, any kind of game that you play ad nauseum. Now, a interesting concept in what is called the Dunning-Kruger effect is essentially, you probably heard this before, it's like basically like ignorance is bliss for the most part. And I always find this graph really interesting because whenever I kind of look at this and then I kind of think about my experiences in EVE or maybe another job in real life or any game that I'm playing, I can kind of almost follow this graph and at certain points kind of start to identify when I my behavior started changing, or maybe when burnout kind of started. So like as you can see here on the graph, when we first start out, when we have low confidence and low wisdom, we're in very little wisdom, we start getting a little bit of confidence, and essentially it peaks up quite rapidly. And then once we kind of hit a certain point in our wisdom, we then have a very steep drop off into like what is called the valley of despair. And this is essentially kind of where burnout kind of happens, because it's kind of a loss of confidence. And in terms of like EVE Online and a lot of behavior you might have noticed from like veteran players, and the more knowledge you get on the game, your confidence goes down. You're extremely good at the game, you know how to do things, but then you kind of already have that perspective of the consequences of a lot of things, so you don't have the benefit of the ignorance is bliss kind of mentality. And it takes a lot to actually get out of that valley of despair. And for me, if I track my kind of EVE career across this graph, starting at the beginning here, I essentially started off mining, did only mining, and I was, slowly getting, wisdom and things like that, and eventually got all the way up to the peak of Mount Stupid. The peak of Mount Stupid for me was probably like starting to train like Rorqual, or already having like 3 alt accounts and just mining like crazy ad nauseum and just going N+1. I started to get a little bit more knowledge in the game, and I started to lose confidence because I knew that everything was so fragile. And then I just went straight down, as you can see, into that valley of despair. And I've taken a lot of hiatuses in EVE. I've come back and went away several times, but every time I come back, I still kind of came back in that valley, because I was still trying to come back and do the same thing I was doing before. It wasn't until I actively started learning more about ratting, and I started learning more about exploration, and I started learning about manufacturing and PI, and I was kind of giving myself a lot of different things, a lot of options of play to do, that I really started to notice I kind of climbed out of this valley. And because I was essentially, getting more knowledge of the game, and I was giving myself a variance of things to do, and as a result of that, I got more knowledge and my confidence started going up. And then you kind of start to get to the end of the graph here, where it's like the plateau of sustainability, where if you're lucky enough to play EVE long enough, or any game long enough, to get out of that valley and you start to get up on that plateau sustainability, you kind of find your sweet spot. You kind of find the thing that you enjoy doing, and then you can do that long term. And a lot of people are not lucky enough to actually get to that point. A lot of people, for most games, once they hit that valley of despair, they're done. They go on to the next thing, right? Because it's just too much work to get more knowledge to get that confidence back. And that's where burnout, I think, happens a lot. I would actually be interested to know how you see yourself kind of going along this graph in terms of like EVE. I know people who are still on Mount Stupid. I know, people who are in the valley of despair right now, and I know people who are on the plateau of sustainability. And I think, everybody watching this can probably identify somebody that they know in EVE on one of these 3 kind of points on the graph. The thing to remember too is you don't know what you don't know. And that kind of goes along with like any game that you play, and like especially competitive and multiplayer games. If you have these people that start playing EVE, they get a little bit of knowledge. They have this over they overanalyze or they overvalue their skill level. And then when they get a little bit more knowledge, they get humbled by the scope at which of everything that they don't know. And that's kind of like the byproduct of actually like just getting better at something. You know, when you start playing Eve, you're kind of in a vacuum for the most part, depending on what activity you're doing. For me, it was mining. And then as I started like getting more knowledge and I started to realize how vast and how complex Eve was, my confidence just took a dive, an absolute dive. And that's puts you into like the valley of despair, which can kind of trigger burnout. And that's where a lot of people don't really crawl out of. The only way to really combat that, and that, you know, when you're in valley of despair, you're subject to things like imposter syndrome, where you can have a decent knowledge of the game, but then you feel like you don't know anything because you know, or and you're aware of everything you don't know. And so the only way to really combat that is to continue learning and to continue to stack knowledge and to kind of continue just kind of fighting. And you know, the one part of this graph that's really not represented is like the slope of enlightenment, which kind of happens when you start coming up out of the valley of despair. And then, you know, as you start adding more knowledge and stuff, your confidence goes back up. And like I said, for me, a lot of that was just learning more about different aspects of the game. And then when you start to kind of fill in all those knowledge gaps that you have, then you get to that plateau of sustainability. And you're able to kind of get a functional level of confidence back. But and I think this is a major problem in like just the gaming community in general is like you have a lot of people who have very little wisdom or knowledge and they have very high confidence. And um then you know, especially in like competitive games, like people when they in Eve, they're like, oh yeah, I've been ratting for you know 2 months and I'm XYZ good at this and that and this and that. And then they start to get into like PvP stuff and they just get humbled. And then they attribute it to whatever else. They, you know, project that onto something else. And then they lose that confidence because they really, people start to show them how much they don't actually know. And then their confidence takes a dive and they burn out. And hopefully this video is interesting for you guys. And like the best way to, you know, kind of fight burnout is to just keep learning, keep giving yourself more knowledge, and you'll get that confidence back up and everything. And lining it up with the Dunning-Kruger effect is just kind of an interesting way to think about it in terms of, you know, behavior trends and things like that, or overconfidence of skill versus imposter syndrome and all of that. But thank you for watching. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.